On this episode of Newt's World, TransAstra is a venture-backed company revolutionizing asteroid mining and the future of the space economy, including technology development and economic modeling and planning for in-space transportation enabled by asteroid mining in an effort to build a transportation network in space. Or, to say it in a simpler way, TransAstra is using asteroids as gas stations for rockets that one day may take us across our solar system and perhaps to galaxies far beyond. I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Joel Sercel, founder and CEO of TransAstra. He has a PhD from Caltech. He is a former Jet Propulsion Laboratory technologist, a 7-time NASA NIAC Fellow, and he holds 20-plus patents. He has led major space engineering efforts at Caltech, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and the U.S. Air Force, and even has an asteroid named after him. Joel, welcome and thank you for joining me on Newt's World. You've had an incredible career, from Caltech to NASA, and now founding TransAstra. What first drew you to space?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first I have to say this is an incredible honor. I've tracked your career for decades, and I'm incredibly grateful for the contributions that you've made to this nation. So the idea that I get to spend some time with you this morning is just a thrill for me. What attracted me to space? The answer is I never wasn't. I grew up in various different places all over the world, but most notably in the Arizona desert. And my father was a jet fighter pilot, and he would take us out camping at night. And in the Arizona desert, the stars are so close and so palpable that you feel a connection to the cosmos. Astronauts describe, when they go into space, a phenomenon known as the overview effect, where they begin to understand that the Earth is just a tiny dot in space. But for me, it was never not that way. And then I would see my father's jet blazing through the night sky, and I knew that was him. And I never had this feeling of separation between Earth and space that most people grow up with. And when you have that different cosmic perspective, you begin very quickly to realize that, as Tsiolkovsky said, Earth is the cradle of humanity, but we can't live in our cradle forever. Humanity is growing exponentially. In order to continue to thrive as a species, we must continue our exponential growth. And to do that, we must tap into the resources of the cosmos. This is just simply axiomatic to me. And we live in this incredibly interesting time where for the first time, humanity, or let's say life from the biosphere of Earth, now has the ability to make the leap into the cosmos and to carry the seed of life into space in order for that which the Earth gave rise to become immortal. It's fantastic.
Here you are in the Arizona desert, you're interested in space, and you go to Caltech, which is maybe the best science institution in the United States or even in the world. I mean, that's quite a jump from the desert.
I got to tell you, it was a dream. So I grew up reading the books of Robert Heinlein, mostly Robert Heinlein, but also Asimov, Clarke, the other science fiction giants. And inevitably, the hero in a juvenile book written by Heinlein would wind up being some disenfranchised boy who somehow wound up going to either Caltech or MIT. And I've been accused of being bright, but people don't know about me is that I grew up with significant learning disabilities, terrible grades, and so on. And so the idea that I could wind up getting a PhD at Caltech is a mind blower.
How did that happen then?
Well, out of college, my first job was working as a researcher at JPL. And I went and told my management at JPL I was going to go back to grad school. And I had this idea for a new kind of space propulsion engine. And I was going to go do a PhD on that if I could. And I was looking around for grad schools. And I had written a proposal to the Air Force Office of Scientific Research to get my graduate work funded. Basically, the management at JPL was a Caltech laboratory. They said, we'd really rather you not go to those other schools. We have an advisor at Caltech who would like to talk to you. And that's how I wound up going to Caltech for graduate school. And then what was really cool is I got to keep my job at JPL during that time. and I had written a proposal to fund it. So I actually did my experiment in the electric propulsion lab at JPL while I was taking classes at Caltech. And I immediately started teaching part-time at Caltech after that.
And was Caltech as extraordinary intellectually as people say it is?
It is extraordinary. It's fantastic. For me, yes, there were some professors there who were just extraordinary. But I have to tell you, at that time in the 20th century, JPL was also a pretty extraordinary place. One of my teachers, by reading his books, had been Carl Sagan. And I got to know Carl Sagan and have lunch with Carl Sagan at JPL. JPL is a Caltech laboratory. And debated him over lunch, and he absolutely sliced me to ribbons. And I found out what a mature and sophisticated mind could do. Yeah, Caltech was fantastic. I've been blessed with getting the opportunity to work with and meet some of the really special historical figures of science and engineering of the 20th and 21st centuries. When I was in high school, I was working actually on asteroid mining, and I wrote a letter to a guy named Freeman Dyson, who was at the Institute of Advanced Studies where Einstein was. He immediately wrote me back, and we started a correspondence that led up until the time of his death a few years ago. Freeman Dyson is one of the great physicists and thinkers in science and related subjects. The idea that I had him as a mentor is just like, you feel so incredibly lucky. It's just, you can't even. And I was honored to be able to introduce him to my son. I have 3 wonderful sons, but one of my sons happens to have his PhD in the same field that I do, background in physics and engineering. And we were able to have lunch together. You know, things like that come from these opportunities. You just feel so blessed and lucky.
When you look back on that, what would you say is the biggest single thing you took from JPL?
It's not a positive. When I started at JPL, I thought the limitations for human activities were the laws of engineering, physics, and economics. And what I found is that humans, and especially large institutional organizations, are primarily motivated by fear of taking risk. And it's interesting, when I was a young man at JPL, I found out later that during those times, I was the most avid user of the library at JPL. And I used to invent things all the time. And the inevitable answer to any invention was, we can't do that. And the other thing I noticed is that while JPL did exquisitely good work, every year it cost more to do their planetary missions than it did the year before. And so they got incredibly good at doing less and less for more. And sometimes more for much more, with very little eye towards efficiency. Efficiency was not rewarded. Risk-taking was not rewarded. But making sure not to screw up was the main thing that rewarded. And so I eventually had to leave. JPL is, I think, the most effective government laboratory in the world. But relative to what is possible, I learned that it's not a place that I could stay. Much respect to the employees, not much respect to the processes and the value system and the culture.
It's interesting how virtually all bureaucracies acquire similar patterns of self-protection.
Yeah, it's a self-organizing system like an organism. And these organisms start to interact with each other, and they take on a Darwinian nature that is about protecting the organism instead of the mission. And they need to be reinvented. They need to be reinvented or terminated. This idea that Elon had of Doge, that every government agency, every law should have a sunset clause, is, I think, absolutely correct.
So, in a sense, you have a chance now to take that insight and apply it in the private sector. Talk about the creation of TransAstra and what you think its mission is.
You know, after leaving JPL, I taught at Caltech and consulted. And I was consulting for a government agency that many of your audience would never have heard of, but they buy a lot of space launch vehicles and that sort of thing. They're located on the East Coast. They told me, hey, there's this company called SpaceX. They say they're going to be building reusable rockets. And there's a government federally funded research and development organization, FFRDC, called the Aerospace Corporation. It's looking them over and helping us decide whether we should certify them for national security launches. But we think they're being pretty conservative, and we need someone with sort of an entrepreneurial bent to look at SpaceX. And this is when the Falcon 9 was a new vehicle, barely had 1 or 2 launches. And so I went out. I'd known Elon a little bit. He's not like my best buddy or anything, but I'd met him in 2006. So I'd known Elon a little bit, and I know Gwen, the CEO at SpaceX, better because she used to try to recruit my students. And so I had this consulting contract for this East Coast agency, this big multi-billion-dollar East Coast agency, to help the government evaluate SpaceX should SpaceX be used for DoD launches. And they wanted someone with a Silicon Valley perspective to come in. So I got a chance to do a deep dive on SpaceX's engineering processes, how they did business, their engineering designs, their culture, that sort of thing. My mind was completely blown. This was the dream that I'd had as a young engineer at JPL, thinking JPL would be like this. But these people, they didn't just talk the talk, they walked the walk. And their efficiency and their ability to innovate was exactly what I'd always dreamed of seeing. So I provided a very strong recommendation that the government do everything they can to start launching on SpaceX, in spite of the fact that literally everyone in the aerospace, that's an exaggerated everyone, most of the powers that be and the authorities in the aerospace industry said that they were going to fail. And then I remember driving back from meeting with the colonel, and it was a bunch of government employees recommending against, me recommending for as a consultant, thinking, okay, the low-cost launch that we were all promised is going to happen. Now what do I do? And I said to myself, that means I need to start an asteroid mining company. That day, I started to gin up ideas for the asteroid mining company, wrote a white paper, and sent it off to Jeff Bezos, who I'd known since the year 2000. I was one of the consultants he brought in to help set up Blue Origin. And he invited me up to Seattle and spent a day with me brainstorming about this. He gave me a tour and everything. And I made the decision at that point to launch TransAstra as a company from the perspective of using asteroids as the resources to launch massive industries into space. And I'm really glad I did. It's been the most fun I've had in my entire career. I've been able to invent at will. I hire brilliant young engineers who I can use as my eyes and hands on the technology to build things. And it's just the funnest thing I could have possibly imagined.
One of your focuses is making asteroid mining a reality. Can you describe why asteroids are particularly interesting?
Yeah, so it's a couple of things. One is, if you go to any planetary body like the moon or Mars or the Earth, they are geologically differentiated. It means they were built out of asteroids and comets and subplanetary bodies over the course of a billion years or so. In the process of being built up, they got hot, they were molten, and all the materials separated out. And what you find on the surface is pretty uninteresting materials that are highly differentiated. Whereas when you go to asteroids, especially primitive asteroids, you're looking at the primitive material that the solar system was first made of. And so if you look at the periodic table, pretty much everything on the periodic table is available. There are some things that are a little less. Nitrogen is an important thing that you don't get a lot in asteroids. But all the ingredients for rocket propellant, all the ingredients for silicon for making solar cells, metals, everything that you need to build industry in space is there. So that's part of it. But the big part of it is, as we say in the space business, gravity sucks. It is very expensive to get into space to overcome the gravity well of the Earth. And it's true also, but to a lesser extent, to the moon and Mars. The reality is, if you can include small asteroids, there are over 1 billion asteroids spread throughout the solar system from near the sun out to beyond Pluto. And so wherever you go, you have this resupply that's just ready there for you to get. And in particular, we have studied and found that there is a population of asteroids. We calculate that there are about 17,000 asteroids in this population that are in what we call highly Earth-like orbits around the sun. That means, everyone learned in school that the Earth orbits the sun at a distance of 1 astronomical unit in a very circular orbit and goes around the sun once a year. Well, there are about 17,000 small near-Earth asteroids that also do the same thing. A few hundred of which we've discovered so far, but we're discovering them very rapidly with new telescopes. That population of asteroids constitutes about 1 million tons of material. And we now have the technology with TransAstra's capture bag and spacecraft that are basically off-the-shelf technology to start going out and getting them and collecting them into a resource base at the top of the gravity well. Now, the beauty of this is that means the resources are much cheaper there in space than if you have to launch them from the Earth. Well, people say, yeah, but low-cost launch is coming. Yes, but even the lowest cost launch that people are envisioning based on, SpaceX's Starship or Blue Origin's New Glenn or Stoke's launch vehicle, it's still going to be very expensive to get into space, more expensive than air travel. And so if you can then multiply that mass by harvesting it in space where you need it, then you move manufacturing of space objects from the ground into space, and you get another factor of 100 or so cost effectiveness. And this is the key to the next wave of space industrialization. And in fact, it's of tremendous strategic importance to the United States. A lot of people look at what's happening in space and they say, well, the U.S. has launched thousands of satellites in the last few years. SpaceX is launching more into space than everyone else in the world. But that's one company. Most analysts who look at what's going on in space come to the following conclusion. If it wasn't for SpaceX, China would already be ahead of us in virtually every way in space. We've got one company that's keeping us ahead. And two, China has massive programs to build fully reusable rockets that will rival SpaceX's in a single-digit number of years. And then the other thing is SpaceX's other big advantage is their manufacturing capability. But anyone that looks at world affairs knows that the leader in manufacturing globally is China. They will have no trouble manufacturing thousands of satellites, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of satellites, as soon as they get the reusable launch thing hacked. So we have a temporary opportunity of advantage, but the only way for us to press that advantage in an enduring way is to move to harvesting resources in space and moving the manufacture of space objects from manufacturing on the Earth and launching them expensively into space to actually harvesting the materials there in space and manufacturing them in situ. What happens when we accomplish that is vast new industries open up and vast new military advantage to our benefit open up.
How much of that will rely on robotics?
All of it. I remember chatting with Jeff Bezos about this many years ago, about what the purpose of humans in space is. This is before the current wave of AI and robotics happened. We both agreed that the purpose of people, for the most part, to be in space is to be in space as a person. It's very quickly becoming true that it just makes no practical sense for people to do missions in space. I've also debated this and discussed this with my good friend, General Steve Quast, call sign Killer, who was one of the architects of the Space Force. And he points out that you really don't want robotics making kill decisions with weapons. That's a reason to put people in space. But all of the reasons to put people into space are intangible. Very quickly, robots will be better than people at literally everything. I have a good friend who's an astronaut who did a couple of EVAs in a short period of time on the space shuttle helping to build the space station. And his shoulders were just completely beat. This is a 5th degree black belt in Taekwondo. He was a complete mess physically after it because of the trials of doing an EVA, a spacewalk in space. Whereas an anthropomorphic robot, either teleoperated or autonomous, that's no problem for them at all. It's really robotic centric.
In your model, do we consistently go to the asteroid, or do we find a really valuable asteroid and try to bring it closer to us?
So what we're going to do is we're going to find a whole bunch of small asteroids, and we're going to build reusable vehicles in space. We're planning to do our first asteroid mission in 2028. We're working with our sponsors right now to make that happen. And that will be a small asteroid that's just a few tens of tons. And what we intend to do is to build a resource base aggregated out of small asteroids and build basically an industrial park and a manufacturing facility in space at the top of the gravity well. The cool thing about it is once you're at the top of the hill, it's easy to fall down through the gravity well to deliver products and commodities anywhere that people need to consume them, especially in low Earth orbit where all the activity is going to be for a few years. So this is the best way to resupply and build for low Earth orbit.
One of the things you've already done apparently is develop a capture bag.
Yes, we're very excited about it. We just had our first launch into space with that and went to the space station and demonstrated its functionality.
What is this all about?
Well, the capture bag is part of our solution to the problem of how you mine and harvest asteroids in space. We basically say there are 4 problems you have to solve. We call them detect, capture, move, and process. Detect is about better telescopes for prospecting. So we've invented the Sutter Telescope, named after Sutter's Mill in California that led to the gold rush. And we own and operate a small global network of telescopes to do that. Capture is, you can't really land on an asteroid. That's a misnomer. And when you do get to an asteroid, it may be crumbly like a sand pile. In fact, most of them probably are. Maybe as soft as a dust bunny, or it may be a piece of rock. And there's no way to know in advance. So what you do is you capture it in a bag. Once you've captured it in a bag, you can start to work with it without making a mess and having it just crumble and fall apart. You capture it in a bag, then you can move it with rocket propulsion and you can process it. We started working on our capture bag several years ago. Capture bag for asteroids was not our idea. It was actually invented by a guy at the NASA Glenn Research Center. And it was studied extensively at JPL for several years before they decided it was too risky for them. What you do is you capture it in a bag, then you can start to work with it. So we flew a small capture bag to ISS, the International Space Station, last week. We've also won a significant contract from NASA to build a larger bag, a 10-meter bag. So that's more than 30 feet in diameter. That's big enough to start and go out and get asteroids. So that's a critical part of our whole plan. Also, capture bags have many other applications. Orbital debris is a navigational hazard. That's a real problem in low Earth orbit. And we can use capture bags to go out. It's been estimated that if there are 50 objects, if you were to pick them up and clean them up, it would eliminate half of the orbital debris problem in low Earth orbit. That's an easy ask for capture bag and our mission partners.
The way your bag works, do you basically creep up behind it so that you are minimizing the speed differential?
Yeah, you basically close the speed differential, which means that you'd use different capture bags for different orbits.
You couldn't have a capture bag if the thing coming straight at you, because it would just blow right through your bag.
Absolutely. The closing velocities in space are so much higher than you can even imagine without technical thinking and engineering. It's completely counterintuitive. And so you basically close to a near zero velocity, open the capture bag. It's held open with struts and torus that are inflated. Fly the capture bag over the object, then close the capture bag. We demonstrated opening the capture bag, closing it, cinching it down, doing that multiple times on the space station last week. But there are important defense applications of this also. Our lead customer in this area is the Space Force. And there are things in space that aren't where they should be as far as the Space Force is concerned. And we define debris as anything that's not where it should be as far as our important clients are concerned. And so we do work with the Space Force on applications also.
Part of this involves, as you said earlier, detect. And you've begun developing the Sutter Telescope Network. What makes it different?
So what makes it different is 2 things. One, we've patented a software architecture and software algorithms, approaches that make it possible for us to process a stack of short images to find moving targets in it, much more efficient than any other method that we're aware of. We think it's the theoretical limit of the minimum compute you can do. The reason that's important is normally it takes the equivalent of a supercomputer working for weeks to process images to find all the moving targets. What's important about that is it means we can build low-cost telescopes with their compute, and the technical term for this is on the edge, where we put the computer in with the telescope. That's thing one. Now, the compute also is part of thing one. The compute is what we call our THEA software, is so efficient it can work on a low-powered space processor. So we've actually uploaded it to a satellite in Earth orbit without much of a computer and shown that that satellite can only track big satellites without our software. But when we turn our software on it, it can see very faint satellites that happen to be very near those big satellites, which is very important to the Space Force. So Sutter technology is for ground and space. Right now, we only routinely operate it on the ground, but it has tremendous potential for going into space. And there are reasons you want to prospect and find things from space because of the sun angles and that sort of thing. So thing one is our software. Thing two is our practical mechatronics. Mechatronics is a field of engineering close to robotics that involves electronics, software, and mechanisms all integrated. And we have very robust modular mechatronics into our telescopes so that we've made them completely modular. So we've actually manufactured them here in our laboratory in Southern California, and then we can deploy them all over the world and very quickly deploy a large network of these. And that's something that the Space Force is very interested in. So it's more cost effective and more sensitivity per dollar than what anyone else has.
Back to the asteroids for a second. I remember reading that there's one asteroid that's been identified that probably has the equivalent, I would think it's $10 trillion of precious metals. In your judgment, in the foreseeable future, will you be able to start identifying small asteroids reasonably close to Earth that could in fact be developed?
Absolutely, we're doing that. We have a list of a few hundred candidates, and we've identified specific asteroids that we're planning on going and doing. So, for example, there's a little asteroid called 2006 RH120 that can fit in our 10-meter bag. It weighs about 30 tons, and we're planning on going out and getting it. Now, this is very significant, Newt, from a space policy and law perspective, because we intend to capture that asteroid in a bag, thereby own all of its resources. That's precedent setting. Then we intend to maneuver it into a permanent, stable orbit with the Earth and set it up as the beginning of a resource base for space manufacturing. That is a seminal historical mission that we're planning on doing in 2028. We think that's a major change in the course of history of humanity in space. And then we anticipate building reusable spacecraft to be able to do that, ramping up over time to as much as twice a week to aggregate as much as 1 million tons of material into that resource base over a period of about 10 years. Being owned by the United States, private sector ownership by the United States as a resource base for the Space Force, for NASA, and for private sector businesses in space. We think that's historic. We think that changes the trajectory of humanity in the cosmos. Because now, for the first time, it's cheap to get the resources to build tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of satellites for many applications, and to start building megastructures. Data processing for AI, crypto, and other things needs to move into space for a variety of reasons. And so we see massive data processing systems being built out of space resources in the near future. And people will want to move into space, and they'll need very large habitats to do it. Habitats that provide Earth normal gravity through spin and radiation shielding from plentiful materials and Earth normal atmosphere. All those resources come from the asteroids to make that happen. There's enough material in the asteroids to build worlds in space with 1,000 times the carrying capacity of the Earth. This is 1,000 years of exponential growth of our species without limits associated with energy and material. Now, that's the long-term vision, but the practical reality is we can start doing this now based on the technology stack that TransAstra has already built. And there are practical benefits today in pivoting into manufacturing things in space instead of on the ground and giving the United States a tremendous business and logistical advantage.
How soon do you think you'll be able to have a system and be able to find an appropriate asteroid to actually make it sort of a venture capital where a company might be set up specifically to actually try to make money out of the process?
TransAstra is a company set up specifically to make money out of the process. We are working right now with sponsors to do that mission in 2028 with a specific asteroid. The name of the asteroid is 2006 RH120. And we have already begun the engineering development of those systems.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty quick.
Well, one of the big tech billionaires who's involved in the space business was recently talking about his realization, and I'm surprised it took him so long to come to it, that the next big business in space is building data processing centers in space. And he said it could be 10 or 20 years from now. As soon as you say it's 10 or 20 years, it's at least 10 or 20 years. You've got to move everything to the left on the calendar, and you've got to be aggressive in your schedules and your projections. If someone says it's more than 10 years, it means they're not serious about it. Look, we flew our first capture bag in space last week. We are in the process of closing contracts to do that mission I just told you about right now. I said too much about it, but I figured if I was going to tell anyone about our secret plan, it would be you. No one's listening today, are they?
I hope a few people do, including maybe a couple of guys that may want to call you about investment opportunities. You're in a real upward curve that, if it works, could be phenomenal.
Well, right now it's a venture tech investment, but very quickly we're going to turn it into an infrastructure investment. And to fulfill the full vision, this is infrastructure. This is tens of billions. But the initial investment to make it go is well within the realm of venture investment.
I am a big fan of nuclear engines, and in particular ion drive, if you're going to go any place much further than the moon, because it seems to me they give you both speed over time, and they give you the nuclear submarine level of not having to refuel every week or every 2 weeks. Do you have any strong feelings either way about the potential nuclear space?
If I'm a card-carrying expert on anything, it's a card-carrying expert on that. I did my PhD in electric propulsion. I, with a guy named John Brophy at JPL, formulated the NSTAR system, which was the first deep space application of ion propulsion. That led to the Deep Space One mission that JPL flew. That led to the Dawn mission, which used the NSTAR system to go to the asteroids Ceres and Vesta. I used to manage NASA's Advanced Propulsion Technology program for the country. This is something I've thought very, very deeply about.
I actually hit it in a good spot. So what do you think?
So I'm a big advocate of electric propulsion for the kinds of applications that SpaceX uses it for, which is station keeping for satellites. But in a capitalistic economic sense, if you want to make money, time is money, and it's too slow. You need high thrust systems. And the game changer here is, the nerd term is in situ resource utilization, ISRU. The game changer here is if you're refueling in space, then specific impulse, which is how we measure the propellant efficiency of a rocket engine, becomes less important. And so what you do is you switch to high thrust systems that can get you around faster. And you have to go fast in business because time is money. You're paying interest on things. So electric propulsion is an important technology. It will always be. We started flying in space decades ago, and now it's a cornerstone technology. But for main propulsion, I just don't see it. Now, there's a much longer conversation that a bunch of nerds can get together about very exotic, advanced implementations and so on. But my short answer is I'm a huge believer in electric propulsion, but not for main propulsion, not for the main drive.
So do you think some form of gas stations, to use a simple term, that allow chemical systems to refuel on a routine basis actually provides a more likely technology for the next generation or two?
Well, electric propulsion will always be here. And it is an important adjunct ancillary technology. No question about it. I'm a huge advocate of it. But there's a reason why companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX are baselining propellant resupply. If you're going to go down to a planetary surface like the moon or Mars, you absolutely need to harvest the propellant there. And in order to land on a planet, you need a high thrust propulsion system, and electric propulsion will never be there. But for station keeping and many other applications, it's super important. I'm actually a huge advocate of a technology called solar thermal propulsion. And in fact, TransAstra has a solar thermal rocket that we call Omnivore. Have you ever heard of solar thermal propulsion?
No, what is it?
Well, you know how nuclear rockets work, right? So a nuclear rocket is basically, it's a nuclear reactor. It could be the size of a refrigerator that gets very, very hot. And then you flow propellant through it and it superheats that propellant. You squirt it out of a nozzle to produce thrust. So a solar thermal rocket is, I think, a much more cost-effective approach. And that is, instead of dealing with all the safety regulations and test concerns and so on of building a nuclear reactor that can run cryogenic propellants through, instead of doing that, you build a solar receiver. And we've built and tested several of these at TransAstra. And then you to a lightweight solar concentrator in space that concentrates sunlight onto the solar receiver. We think it's about 1% the cost of a nuclear rocket for about 80% of the performance. And we think that is a really powerful solution that the community has kind of overlooked. From an engineering perspective, I'm a huge advocate of nuclear rockets. But from a cost, effectiveness, and overall, is it a good solution? I don't think it is. But solar thermal is a very exciting prospect.
Let me show ignorance, because I thought I had read somewhere that if you had an ion drive and you're talking about going beyond the moon, that its continuous acceleration means you actually have to be very fast over time. You're not fast the first 2 days, but because you're continually accelerating. Is that inaccurate?
It's not inaccurate, but it's a little bit of a misnomer. The way we measure velocity in space is very different from the way we measure velocity on the Earth, and it means something very different. And so we're mixing these mathematical concepts from space mission design with our terrestrial understanding. In space, there's a parameter called delta V. And delta V has a units of velocity, miles per hour or meters per second or whatever. And so people confuse it with a velocity, but it's not a velocity. It's a measure of the energy that the propulsion system has to deliver to get you from point A to point B. And electric propulsion can deliver much more delta V, but it takes years to deliver that delta V, and we don't have years to wait. While there's truth in what you just said, the devil's in the details, and you really have to understand the physics and mathematics to put it in perspective. Let me just say this also. There are world-class card-carrying experts who would disagree with me. And we would have a technical discussion that for me as a nerd would be a lot of fun. And if you don't know the math, it would be interesting. And so, I recognize that there is not a unanimity of view. But the leading space technology companies all have electric propulsion systems, mostly for station keeping. But for main delta V, when you're in a hurry and you need to make money, it comes down to high thrust systems, which could be advanced chemical propulsion, solar thermal rockets. Those would be my two choices. And I think solar thermal has the greater potential in space because chemical rockets require that you get the right chemicals. But TransAstra's Omnivore propulsion system is called Omnivore because it can use anything as propellant, even just water.
If we were serious about it, how far are we from being able to create a working solar thermal rocket?
A couple of years. It's not a matter of feasibility. It's just a matter of dollars. It was invented in the 1950s by one of the rocket engineers that came over from Germany after World War II. His name was Kraft Ericke, and he was actually an instructor of mine at the Air Force Academy. I found out about it because I brought him my notes from this invention that I had had in high school that I called the solar-powered rocket. And I showed it to him, and I said, "What do you think of this?" And he reached into his briefcase and showed me his 1957 paper and said, "Son, I was there first." It's not magical technology, but it does require some work to make it happen.
It's kind of wild. Look, this has been very exciting. I hope maybe a year from now we can redo this because I'm confident at the rate you're moving, you're going to have lots and lots of things. That's going to be very, very interesting.
This has been fun. Thank you so much for the insightful questions.
Joel, I want to thank you for joining me. The pioneering work that TransAstra is doing is a result of your leadership and extraordinary expertise. And I'll let our listeners know they can find out more about the work you're doing at transastra.com.
It's really an honor to meet you, Newt. I think about how lucky we are that you did the contract with America and what condition this country would be right now without it. You've made your mark on history in a very significant way, and we should all be grateful for it. And the idea that I get to meet you, in addition to all these other wonderful people that I've met in my career, is just a delight.
Thank you to my guest, Dr. Joel Sercel. You can learn more about TransAstra on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at Gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.